Welcome to the Survivor's Guide to Thriving podcast, the show for people who are ready to break out of survival mode in order to build a truly thriving life. I'm Amanda Solman, and along with Mark Jewell, my co-host and the founder and CEO of Mark Jewell Speaking and Training, we break down common roadblocks that keep people stuck surviving and share ideas to help you thrive each and every day. This week, Wade Johannes and I are talking about how to take your relationship to the next level. While our conversation focuses more on close personal relationships like marriage or serious dating relationships, from time to time we also venture into how similar concepts can be applied to business connections, relationships with your kids, or even friendships. There are some really great ideas here for any stage of a relationship, and hopefully you can find at least a few to try out. So let's head over to the show. Wade, to get us started, I am curious. You proposed this topic. So what are some of your thoughts on why it is so important to really invest in your personal relationship and keeping in mind the one that's most close to you? Because we talk a lot about business on this podcast. So why are we talking about relationships?
So a couple of weeks ago, Amanda, I had the opportunity to work with I'll call them early career managers. So either they were in their first management role or they were about to be. They're being groomed to be a future manager. And I asked them, just like Mark does in our training events, so what would our time look like? What would make this a worthwhile use of your time here today? And they came up with a very extensive list. It was about 15, 20 items. And for a second there, I kind of swallowed my gum just looking at the list thinking, oh my gosh, this is really a long list. How are we going to get through all this? Well, when I started to break it down, I came to the realization that a third of the issues were all about relationships. And so we spent an hour talking about how to build, strengthen, grow existing or start new relationships. And that knocked out a third of their asks, which is really pretty incredible when you think about these people and what's really on their mind and what they're really wanting to get solved. And it has to do with how do I connect better with the people around me?
Yeah. And specifically, as we look at kind of that really close personal relationship, what I find as I'm out talking with folks or in coaching calls is that, well, two observations. One, that relationship is usually one of the first things get put on the back burner when it comes to, when life gets hectic, right? So work's crazy, kids have tons of activities all over the place. And so that relationship is one of the first things to sort of go on the back burner and just assume it's going to be there, right? So we kind of take it for granted. But I also know kind of two sides of the same coin. That relationship can either be a safe haven when things are crazy, right? That person that you can come home to and talk to, vent to, who will give you ideas, who will just plain listen, right? Like that can be a really powerful person in your life. On the flip side, if that relationship is not going well, it's like this dark cloud that hangs over everything. And so it doesn't surprise me that, you're in this training event and, technically those folks were there for work, right? But when you start asking like, what's the things that are on your mind? What's the things that, you're thinking about? It doesn't surprise me that those relationship topics come up, because if that's not operating, at a 10, at 100%, it's gonna weave its way into impacting other parts of your life, don't you think?
Yeah, absolutely. I mean, when you have something going on outside of work, and let's just say it's one of those relationships that you value the most, and when something is not working outside of work, it's impossible to leave that at the door. We've been telling ourselves for decades that, you leave home at home, you leave work at work. If we're being honest with ourselves, how real is that? I mean, we are more connected today than we've ever been. So let's give up the BS story and let's get to work. Let's figure some of this stuff out. When you look at the Survivor's Guide to Thriving Pyramid and what it means to be in survival mode, it's, complacency and it's unrecognized potential. And if that is where your best relationship is, if we're just fine, then we've got work to do. And so that's one of the things that we dig into, because, man, I know for me personally, I cannot perform at the level that I'm capable of without my marriage being rock solid and on fire. It has to be a 10 or above for me to perform and execute on all levels.
Yeah, and I want to hit on something that you just mentioned there, and that was this idea of complacency or unrecognized potential, right? We think about that a lot in terms of our job, like, where am I getting complacent? Where do I have room to grow? But I don't think that people often think about their marriages or their relationships that way. But it is a really good context to kind of look at your marriage and go, when someone asks me, oh, how are you in fill in the blank, your wife, your husband, your girlfriend, boyfriend, whatever, how are you guys doing? And if you were to say, we're okay. We're just fine. Like, what if there could be more? And I think that's something that we talk a lot in our programs that might be different from other professional development programs out there or other coaches out there is we do look at that whole person. And a key part of that is whatever that most important relationship is, most likely a marriage for a lot of folks. And so I just kind of want to hit that consider as you're looking at your own relationship. Are you complacent? Are you taking it for granted? Or is there room to take that thing to the next level if you would invest in it a little bit, which is what we're going to be talking about, some ideas for doing here today. Wade, one other thing that I wanted to kind of talk about as we're just doing the setup here, you mentioned for decades, right? We've been trying to separate home and work, like there's this unbreakable barrier in between the two, even though we all know that's not reality. But the other thing that I often hear from folks is even when they are on their personal time, and when you talk about, okay, how's your relationship? How's your marriage doing? How often do you go out on dates, which is something we'll dig into it at length here shortly. But, and they say, oh, we're just so busy, right? My kids have sports activities. We got band concerts to go to. We're running errands. We got the farm. We got all of this other stuff. And so even in the context of personal time, the relationship gets set to the back burner. And I think one of the things that we want to really hit home about as we walk through the rest of this conversation is just to reconsider, does it have to be that way? One of the things that has really stuck with me is this idea of, what are you trying to teach others through your relationship? Right. And I once heard somebody say, and I don't remember who it was, but the idea has kind of stuck with me. And it's especially related to relationships where there are kids involved. And often, kids get our first attention and whatnot. But this person was saying that especially when you're in a family with kids, what do you want to teach them? Do you want to teach them that your relationship exists because of them, or the other way around? And that was really powerful to me, that, you really want to teach your kids, like, those kids are there because you have a marriage that is just operating on all cylinders, versus you have a marriage that's only existing because there are kids in the picture. And I know that's, it's maybe kind of a negative way to look at it, but that just really resonated with me, because I think it's a perspective check as to, maybe I should invest more in this marriage because I want my kids, or I want my friends, or I want my coworkers, or whatever, that I want them to see that this is a priority for me. And that when you have a really good relationship, it can create a lot of other really awesome things as well. So that's just something to think about, is like, what message are you sending based on how high up the priority you're treating your relationship?
Absolutely. So, we've got 4 kids, ages 5 to 12. And without a doubt, our kids know that my marriage comes before them. And that's something that my wife Nicole and I talk about quite often, really, because we see the longer view. Okay, and we know that there's a lot of our friends and extended family that view that as being backwards. Kids come first, but you think about what we want for them later on in life when they meet that special someone and get married. What if their spouse viewed something else as being more important than their marriage? We wouldn't want that for them. We want them to be closer to their husband or their wife than they are to their parents or their kids. And so it's about being very intentional about modeling the right behaviors for what we want in the long term.
Well, and I think it's, a good reality check for a lot of folks. I know my parents went through this a few years ago. Like, you eventually those kids will grow up and leave the nest, right? And the person who's left is the other person in your marriage. And the question is, will you have done the steps to make that a good transition, or will that be a real struggle because that's a relationship that's been neglected? So, I know listening to this podcast, we'll have people who kind of range the gamut, right? From empty nesters all the way down to people who are early in relationships where that idea is something that's a long way off, or they haven't even thought about, or whatever. But I just think that's a good reality check too, is like, if you are a family that has kids in it, eventually those kids will move on and live their own lives. So we need to be taking the steps early and often to make sure that relationship is prepared for the long run. But also, to your point, like, even in the moment when kids are there, investing in your marriage is how you make sure that you're a team when you're parenting kids in the first.
Well, making sure that we don't tie our identity to what our kids are doing or who our kids are. The same thing happens when somebody ties their identity to their career, to their position in the company or their business or whatever that is. We got to check that as we're climbing this ladder in life, that our ladder is leaning up against the right building.
Yeah, I love that analogy for sure. So clearly, we've outlined here at least our opinions on why this is such an important topic. So let's really dig into kind of the nitty gritty. Let's dig into tips and suggestions and ideas to consider. So Wade, when you are in coaching, and you've got somebody who, identifies, man, maybe I have been neglecting this relationship, or maybe, it's going fine, but there's probably room for growth. What are some things that you start to talk about with them?
Yeah. So one of the things that is a great way to benchmark where you're at is a simple scale from 1 to 10. How's your relationship going? And, it's their opinion, and the other person in that relationship might give it a completely different score, but from their perspective, it's a benchmark. And so let's say they give their marriage a 7. Okay, 7, that's pretty good. Why did you give it a 7? And then whatever they say, okay, so what would that look like if that's an 8 or a 9? And you start to discover what's possible. And then, then it's a choice whether or not they go into that or not. But that is, the same thing goes with coworker relationships, with customer relationships. Just ask them, scale from 1 to 10, where are you at? And what would that look like for that to be 1 or 2 bumps higher? And when they start to realize where they're at and what's possible, what I found is that the people that we coach, they usually step forward, and I'll say most of the time they step forward and do the work, and they start to see the benefits of what a stronger relationship in that area. Once again, whether it's a customer or coworker or with your spouse or your kids, all of them are the same way. And so, but it starts with being aware with where you're starting from.
Absolutely. That awareness is so critical. Like, we can't fix what we aren't paying attention to. And that goes for a lot of different things. But to your point, it happens in marriages, right? That's how we get to that complacency, is we just haven't been paying attention, right? We just assume it's going to be We haven't been watching. The other thing, though, that you said that I like about this strategy is, especially when you do it with the other person in the relationship, is it's really a very simple way to start a dialogue, right? I think one of the
Hmm.
reasons um, why we're not having these conversations in relationships is they seem kind of scary, because what if the other person says that I'm not, doing a good job, or I'm not pulling my weight? And there's something so simple of like scale of 1 to 10. You and I both have our scales, and using that as a starting point to say, okay, where could we take it to the next level? And so I really like that as a very simple conversation starter.
The one thing about asking your spouse about, scale from 1 to 10, how are we doing? Just be aware they will ask you to rate the same thing right at the very end. So just be ready when you ask that question. It will come back.
Oh, awesome. Just like anything, right? You don't get to, it's give and take.
That's right. That's right. Another tool that we use quite often is to have them. We'll send them a link to the 5 love languages, and it's a free assessment. But essentially, there are 5 love languages, and this goes for any human being, even your kids. And there's excuse me, 5 love languages for children as well. And the 5 love languages that I'm referring to are acts of service, quality time, gifts, physical touch, and words of affirmation. And so the assessment will, and I think it only takes like 5 or 10 minutes for people to take, but you realize what your top two are. So what is your love language? And I know Mark talks about it with his marriage, and he thought he was going above and beyond, in working on his marriage, and came to realize that he was speaking a totally different language than what Vanessa spoke. And so that assessment, as simple as it is, it creates a dialogue. To your point exactly. I know one of my coaching clients, he and his wife took that right before they had I think it was about a 4-hour drive going somewhere over the weekend. And he said, Wade, that 4 hours was the best conversation we've had in years. Years. And it was simply because they had a discussion that got them outside of their rut, and they started to have a discussion about what was possible. And he said from that point on, both of them are completely bought in that, hey, this is something that it works. It's legit.
I can speak from personal experience to say that that 5 love languages quiz really was a game changer for us, my husband and I. And not so much, I wouldn't say necessarily surprising about what the languages were for each of us, but more putting them into context. So, it's kind of it's a silly example, but my husband knows that I like his help when I'm loading the dishwasher, or I like his help when I'm picking up the or doing the laundry, or whatever it is, right? But I think for a long time he was like, "Man, she's just naggy. Man, she just wants me to do all household tasks," right? And when we started doing this love languages assessment and kind of talking through what it meant, this shift in perspective that it's not just I like you to do these things, but I feel as though you really love me when you do these things for me. Same thing. He's more of a quality time person, whereas I am completely happy to do things on my own, whatnot, right? So again, it's a little bit opposite for the two of us. But for me to realize, when he wants to go for a walk after a day of work, or do some other activity together, it's not just because he can't do it by himself, which is like my first reaction, right? Well, can't you just go do that on your own? Like, why do I have to do it with you? It helped me switch perspective is, oh, when I spend that one-on-one quality time with him, it makes him feel as though he's really loved. And so if you have not taken that quiz, I would really, really encourage it. Even if you think you know what the other person is, but to your point, Wade, to like use it as a conversation starter, because I think the other thing too is you don't all show up the same way for everyone, right? For me, acts of service really is a lot of times about cleaning the house, but for other people, it might mean something totally different, right? Same with gifts or words of affirmation. So even just to use it as a conversation starter is a really good tool. And I will make sure to include a link to that quiz in the show notes because if you haven't taken it, I would really encourage it.
Absolutely. Yeah. So my biggest one for me is words of affirmation. So, but it goes both ways. Okay. So while words of affirmation is what fills me up, it also is what hurts the most. So if something negative is said, that's what I internalize. For Nicole, it's quality time. And so a lot of you know that I love to read. And for a while, I'd go, in my office and read my book and thinking that, okay, I'm working on myself and my self-improvement, right, Amanda? But what I didn't intend to happen was by not sitting with Nicole in front of the TV, whether I'm reading a book or not, I was taking away some quality time for her. So one minor shift that we made in our household, and it comes through talking through this and, hey, this is how I feel and this is what I'm thinking. We came to realize that, hey, just grab your book and go sit with me out here. And that's what fills her up.
It was funny. I was actually, I get the e-newsletter from the Love Languages people. And that was one of the recent e-newsletters that they put out was that, for as much as something will fill you up, it's also the thing that will tear you down if you receive the opposite. For like acts of service, it said, helping around the house, that's a great thing. Creating messes for the person who likes acts of service to clean up, not such a great thing. So there's an equal and opposite reaction to everything. I think the other thing that stood out for me in this quiz, and kind of talking with people more as well, and it goes back to Mark's example too, is that we either, one, assume that we know the language of the other person, sometimes assuming we know what that all gets us. But two, a lot of times we will treat others the way we like to be treated, because that's what we are used to. So like if I'm an acts of service person, my first gut reaction is to do acts of service for others to show them that I love them. Whereas they might be a quality time person, or maybe they're more of a gift type person, right? And so we also have to be careful about assuming that what we appreciate, everyone appreciates, because that may or may not be true depending on who the other person is.
Yeah. So you talk about assuming, and I'll just say a lot of guys assume that their wife or significant other loves gifts. We make that assumption. And, so we show up on Valentine's Day or the anniversary with all these gifts. And if they are acts of service and quality time, we're just wasting money, to be perfectly honest. I had a coaching client.
Sometimes we'll take your gifts, but yes.
Oh, yeah, I suppose so. But and it was actually the same coaching client that I just referred to at the 4-hour drive, but he came to the realization that, hey, I could go buy her a new car, but if I really want to show her that I love her, just clean up after myself. And that simple, extra 30 seconds as you're leaving the house speaks her language versus coming home with a special surprise.
I mean, it's the same as in so many other areas of life. Instead of wasting your time doing a bunch of things, you could spend less time doing the right things and get way more results out of it. So I think that's really where this quiz comes in, is it allows you to do, more of the right things, which can be done with less time wasted, less money wasted if you're a big gift giver, right? Or that sort of. So definitely check that out. The next thing, Wade, as we continue to talk about tips, and we are going to dive into a few, we're going to spend a little bit of time on this. But I know one of the suggestions that we make a lot in coaching is the idea of date night. So talk to me a little bit. What are the conversations you have with your coaching clients around date night? And maybe even where has this shown up for you?
Yeah, so my story is one that I usually start my coaching calls with in terms of when this subject comes up on date night. So this would have been 10 years ago, probably 2008. And Nicole and I were living in a different community. Um, and really, at that point in our lives, we had two young kids, and she was traveling out of town to work with the two kids. I was doing my own thing, and we were not at a very good place in our marriage. And I'm just being open and honest about that. So one night she came home and she said, "Hey, just so you know, I've got a babysitter for Friday. I'd like to start date night." And I don't, she tells me that she doesn't remember me saying this, but inside my thought was, oh man, date night. Can't we just go hang out with our friends, go to the bar? It's been a long week. I just want to go have some fun and unwind. And apparently I didn't say that. In my memory, I did say that. But anyways, so we went out for dinner and just had dinner, just the two of us, and, just talked. And that started a major shift in our relationship. And so now I'm going to say at least once a week, we go out for date night. And it doesn't have to be a Friday night. It doesn't have to be a weekend. It even doesn't even have to be at night. You can go have a date lunch. But when we do that, we created a space for us to talk about things when they're small before they become big issues. And so we invest that time with each other, one-on-one, without distractions, and we just talk. And we talk about things other than what the kids have going on. And I call it logistics and people management and who's going where and who's going to which game and whatnot. We're not talking about that stuff. We're talking about, how are you doing? What's going on? How are we doing? And through that process and through that, I'm going to call it an investment of time in each other. Now we're at a place where our marriage it can always be a little better, right? But I'm going to say it's rock solid because I know where she's at. She knows where I'm at. We have that trust of each other. But it came as a result of being intentional about investing that time on a consistent basis. For us, that's once a week. And you know what? Going back to what we were talking about earlier, it's about modeling for our kids that, hey, our marriage comes first. And so that's what's worked really well for us. But just understand there's a lot of different ways that could look in different relationships.
Yep. And I want to dig into that a little more. So you've mentioned a few things so far, but as you are really designing what you would determine to be kind of that top tier awesome date night, what are some considerations that you would encourage other people to keep in mind?
Yeah. So part of this, and I'll just go back to the 5 love languages, but quality time is Nicole's greatest. That's the way I can speak her language. So we, we'll get a little bit dressed up so we feel good, and go have dinner somewhere, maybe have a couple of drinks, and we just talk. But we're not on our phones. We're not with a bunch of people. This is our time. And so we're very protective of our time together. And even, one thing that, as we share this idea with friends and other people that we know, other people have other ideas on how this can work. So one example is, earlier in life, we went to just a ton of weddings right out of college, it seems like every week you have another wedding to go to. And that's fine. You're with your friends and you're with a lot of people, but leave an hour early and just have, go have a beer with your spouse before everybody else comes in, and create that space to be one-on-one. Because if we don't do that, then all of a sudden, we're around each other, but we're not connecting at the same level.
Mm-hmm. I like that idea of like, you're already going to something. How can you kind of build in an extra piece? That's my efficiency brain going to work there.
There you go.
I think that's something though that I really wanted to kind of highlight is, what date night looks like for you may not be the same as what it looks like for me. Like, I'm married but have no kids, and so it looks a little different for us sometimes, versus Mark or any of our clients, right? These things could look a little different. I think the key part is to know sort of what your goals are with with a date night, right? So, you mentioned it is really important to have that time to talk to one another, to, really focus on the relationship versus, the logistics of everyday life. But there might also be some other goals. So perhaps your spouse is a words of affirmation person. So maybe date night can become an opportunity for you to cheer them on or cheer each other on by, maybe you go and do a workout together where you get to really support one another. Or I know Mark and Vanessa, I believe, have gone to like the batting cages for date night before. Maybe they went to dinner and out at batting cages, right? So like, depending on what the love languages of your spouse, there might also be some other ways to really incorporate some of that language into your date night. So that's something to think about. The other thing is, to your point earlier, like it doesn't have to look a certain way. So, if you go out to dinner every week, maybe you have the same restaurant or you order the same thing, like that could get boring too. Like, even though you're creating that space, you can imagine, that the routine would sort of wear on the uniqueness of it. And so maybe you do meet up for breakfast or lunch, or maybe it's not a meal. I don't know. I always think of dates around meals, but that's because I like to eat. But, so you can really make that look however you want. I think the trick is just making sure that if there are activities involved or something like that, that it's, it's not just distraction from that connection, right? You can imagine where maybe you only go to a movie, so therefore you just spent 2 hours not talking to each other, which, maybe it's great to have that reprieve from, the responsibilities of work or the responsibilities of kids or whatnot, but it's not really connecting. So like, really consider what your schedule is, or what your priorities are and what you want to accomplish. I think that was something you said is, this idea of be intentional about your priorities when you're out on that date, because it will make it so much more effective.
Yeah. So when Nicole and I were dating, and granted, we are not normal. Okay. So keep that in mind. But we actually, I think our first movie that we watched together was like a year into our relationship, because the thought of sitting next to each other and not talking for an hour and a half, we couldn't handle that. So we would find other things to do besides go sit in a movie, which I know is often a date night type event. But when you think about what do you really want, how do you want to use this time, what do you want to get out of this, I think maybe there's some other things to consider. So yeah, there are a lot of different things you can do. Last fall, I went for a workout with Nicole. And so it was me, Nicole, and 26 other women in the room. And we did a workout. And you know what? I was cool with it. I mean, it was fun. And you should have heard how many, oh my gosh, Nicole, I can't believe your husband came. This is awesome. You must be so happy. How many of those comments you got on the way out. So that, filled us both up with my words of affirmation that I had done the right thing.
Yeah, absolutely. And I think that's what's interesting too, sometimes about tacking on an activity of sorts to, just dinner or just lunch or whatnot is it can create some more fun conversation fodder too, for when you do kind of go back to, the one-on-one away from the activity. I mean, we're the opposite. We love going to the movies. Like we really enjoy that. But it's fun for us because then we go out to dinner, and in addition to talking about us, we get to dive into, well, what did you think? And, all of that good stuff. So it's whatever works for your relationship. But I do think
Absolutely.
It would be a fun change up to just going out to eat, that by itself. So, I mean, the other way to think about it is literally go back to your actual dating days. If you've been married for a while, maybe you haven't been dating in a while, but like think about, if I was just meeting this person and really trying to impress them, what would I do? So maybe you would go on an activity, or maybe you would take them to a fancy restaurant, or maybe you would bring them a gift. I don't know. But I think that can be an interesting way to think about things, because again, so often we get complacent in this relationship that we stop thinking about impressing the other person. when maybe that's a healthy frame of mind to jump into as you're planning your date.
Mm-hmm. Yeah. Yeah. So let's take this back to the business realm. So, one thing that customers hate is when, you know, their salesperson or their company representative takes them for granted. No one wants to feel like they're being taken for granted. And so, sometimes they act out just to try to get attention. Same thing with kids, same thing with spouses. So it all comes back to, it takes quality time and quantity time to build any relationship. Okay. So if you think about business, and if I'm selling seed and I sell seed to this particular farmer, and drop it off in the spring, and I don't come back until he's in the field in the combine, how strong is that relationship? It's not. It's completely transactional. And so the farmer is likely going to make his decision based on what's the yield and how did it perform. And that is completely different than going out there and being present throughout the growing season and bringing them out to the field. Here's your stand count. Here is your plant health report. Here is pollination. Hey, by the way, you're going to want to pick this number first. And by going out there and creating that space, you strengthen that relationship, which at its core comes down to trust. Is this person going to follow through on what they say they're going to do? And it takes reps to get there. So the same thing goes for a relationship that you have with a kid. And, I know this is an unfortunate situation for some, but I mean, if we only see them on their birthday and holidays, that's a completely transactional relationship as well. And so we have to be there through the good times and the bad in order to strengthen that relationship.
We do treat that marriage sometimes as transactional, and it does take it takes reps. I love that analogy of it takes reps to get good at it. As you started talking about that combination of quality and quantity time, I think of how many relationships kind of the only time they get any sort of one-on-one investment is maybe they go on a vacation once a year. Right. So maybe they're that famous, like 1 week, no kids, just mom and dad vacation. And I'm not saying that you shouldn't do that. Like, I am all about vacation. But if that's the only time all year that you're really getting, good one-on-one relationships, that's like if the only time you see that customer is when you take them to the big corporate event once. Right? Like, it's nice and it's appreciated, but if it's really going to be a long lasting relationship and it's really going to mean something, there needs to be more frequent reps done.
Yeah, that's really how you get to know another person, is being around them. One personal situation that we identified and brought some attention to is that, with family coming for, birthdays and holidays, they were around our kids, but only on those special days. And so we created space for them to be around them when there was nothing else going on. And they got to know them individually on a much better level as a result of that quantity time when there was nothing else going on. So the same thing goes for, a marriage. The same thing goes for a customer relationship. It's all the same. We have to be out there. We have to be out there getting to know the customer's farm when there's nothing for them to buy. If we're only out there, and this is one of the mistakes that I see a lot of them are 5 to 7 year salespeople. They just think, okay, I know where I'm at. I know I don't have to go out there till March 1st, and then he'll make his decision, and then I'll get the order. And we assumed that will be fine because that's what worked the last 6 years. In the meantime, somebody else is, let's just say, courting that customer, and we think we're fine, and all of a sudden, boy, they're really showing a lot more effort than what I'm getting from my current supplier. And their business moves without us knowing it. And, so much of this is about being present, whether it's out in the country or, in a relationship with your family member. You have to be present, and you have to create that space and be intentional about it, because otherwise it's just not going to happen.
Hmm. And the other parallel that I sort of draw in that same idea is when it feels like you only come to me when you want something. Right. So,
Yeah. Oh, yeah.
or you're only nice to me when you want something. Right. So in the business world,
Right.
it's where you haven't nurtured that relationship. So the customer knows when you drive up the driveway, it's because you're coming to ask for that order versus
Yeah.
talk about, what are the goals of the business. And I think we hear jokes about this in marriages all the time, right? Like, if you're the spouse and maybe your spouse is being really nice to you. So you go, oh man, he must want something. Or, oh man, she must want something. Because literally
or they screwed up.
You're over nice is when you've screwed up or you want permission for something, right? And so versus getting into a deeper relationship where if you are looking for something or you're looking for forgiveness, that's a deeper conversation than just oh man, he's being nice to me, that's not normal, right? We don't want to get into
right.
that. And date night can be a really good platform for that.
Right. You talked about things when they're small instead of when they blow up into something bigger. So one of our coaching clients, I think he picked up flowers on his way home. After our training event, he was feeling good, and you know what? He wanted to invest in his relationship. Picked up some flowers, brought them home to his wife, and she was excited about it. And then she started telling her friends about, my husband bringing flowers home, and one of her friends said, that's a red flag. He must have done something that you don't like. And, I think that is something that we need to be aware of. I'm trying to bring attention to this point. We talk about how you're the average of the 5 people that you surround yourself with. So if you're in a relationship and you're surrounded with other people who are also strong in their relationships, you're going to respond differently. If you are surrounding yourself with people who have broken relationships, it's only a matter of time before there's going to be stuff that comes into your door.
All right, Wade, as we wind down here, any other thoughts that you want to share on the topic of relationships?
Yeah, so you want to make sure you're recognizing the right behaviors. So if somebody is doing something that really speaks to you and you really appreciate it, tell them that. It's amazing how many times we get in a coaching scenario where they're appreciating something that their spouse did. And I ask them, did you tell her? Well, no, she understands. Like, no. We need to make sure that we recognize the right behaviors. And so here at MJST, we talk about the appreciate, celebrate, accelerate conversation. So when we take time to appreciate it and to recognize it, guess what? We're going to get more of it. So that's one of the keys. The other one is just being very intentional about avoiding distractions. And, this is one that we oftentimes don't realize what we're doing, but something as simple as when we first get home, 15 minutes, no screen time. It's amazing how, diverted our attention is. We know what that feels like on the other end. When I'm telling somebody something and they're looking at their phone instead of listening and processing what I'm saying, that doesn't feel very good. So avoiding distractions on the screen time and technology front. The other thing though is people can be a distraction, other people. So, we talked about it a little bit, with the wedding and making sure that we are creating a space to be one-on-one, but I've also seen where people don't want to have that conversation with their spouse. And so they surround themselves with other people or they make themselves busy. And in doing so, they never have time or the energy to talk one-on-one and actually get real. And that is something that, just be very careful in how busy we pack our calendars and make sure that we are making the right priority on what we want long-term.
Very good. Good thoughts all around. Excellent. Wade, thank you very much for coming on the show today, talking about a topic that I think everybody can relate to in some way, shape, or form. And hopefully people will take away some of these tips here that we've discussed and put them to work in their own relationships. So again, thank you very much for coming on.
Awesome. Thank you, Amanda.
Thanks again to Wade for joining us on the pod this week. To connect with him further, just look for Wade Johannes on LinkedIn, Facebook, and Snapchat. If you like what you heard, make sure to jump over to Apple Podcasts and leave us a rating and review. We appreciate the feedback, and it also helps other people find the show. As always, if you're looking for more resources to go from surviving to thriving, check out our website at www.markjeweltraining.com. That's Jewel with 2 L's. And you can find us under Mark Jewel Speaking and Training on all the major social networks. Remember, survival is dead. It's your time to thrive today. See you next week.